Hey, good afternoon, everybody. I just want to touch on a important story that's coming out of the Sudan, which is currently undergoing a civil war and a crisis that has been brewing for many decades under the corrupt president Bashir Omar al-Bashir. And the currently, right now, according to CBS News, the death toll is over 500 people, 4,000 wounded. And according to the World Health Organization, there's a tense 72-hour ceasefire that was extended for 3 days last week. It's a fragile truce, so basically it could resume any second, actually. So what I want to do is basically show you an article by CBS News. As you can see here, two Sudanese generals are at war with each other. Here's what to know. So let's read together, right? The clashes in Sudan are between the Sudanese Armed Forces led by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan and the Rapid Support Forces paramilitary group led by General Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo. Until recently, the leaders of the two forces were allies. They worked together in 2019 to overthrow Sudanese brutal dictator Omar al-Bashir, who ruled over the country for 3 decades, sweeping to power. Thousands of people took to the streets in a popular uprising over Bashir. Now, there's a little bit of history with 9/11 here regarding Omar al-Bashir, because in 1992, it was the president Omar al-Bashir with the leader of the National Islamic Front, Hassan al-Turabi, that invited Osama bin Laden to come to the country after he was exiled in Saudi Arabia for trying to pressure or persuade the Saudi kingdom to use the Arab Mujahideen fighters against Iraqi forces who were mounting an alleged invasion of the country, which was untrue. Nevertheless, bin Laden traveled to Sudan and he bought some property in Khartoum and also built businesses, spent tens of millions of dollars in this country. And actually, the CIA threatened Bashir with sanctions in the country if they did not expel the venerable al-Qaeda leader. And they did in 1996 and went back to Afghanistan. Nevertheless, al-Bashir took advantage of bin Laden's generosity and built some infrastructure and basically was allowed to reside in the country, knowing full well that the group al-Qaeda was building training bases there and launching attacks, or was instrumental in attacks against U.S. troops in Somalia in the Battle of Mogadishu. So why did the fighting in Sudan start? Because those two generals were actually under the ranks of al-Bashir, but al-Bashir's corruption led to his overthrow of the country, and now they've been under turmoil ever since. So in 2021, al-Burhan, who had become chief of the Power Sharing Council, dissolved it and declared he would instead hold elections in 2023. Let me seem small here, so I just want to put up more. The current fighting broke out between the army and the RSF as a result of negotiations breaking down over integrating the two forces ahead of the intended restoration of civilian rule. There was disagreement over which general would be subordinate to the other and how quickly the RSF would be incorporated into the Sudanese military. So what does this mean? What they wanted to do basically was to have a country that would be democratically elected a president and to have the two groups dissolved into the national army. However, there was some disagreements between these two generals about how that would come to be, because each general wanted a little bit of recognition as being a leader of their specific fronts. This is what I'm guessing anyway. Having fighting broke out over the country on April 8th, which Sudanese capital of Khartoum and neighboring Omdurman being turned into battlefields. And you can see the destruction here, Khartoum. The U.S. Military successfully evacuated just under 90 U.S. diplomatic personnel from Sudan, including the American ambassador from the U.S. Embassy in Khartoum, the White House said, adding that the U.S. would be temporarily suspending operations at its embassy. U.S. officials told CBS News on Monday that the government was considering multiple options to get American nationals out of Sudan. It remained unclear how many U.S. nationals are in Sudan, but the Associated Press said approximately 16,000 were registered with the American embassy as being in the country. And as you can see, here's Sudan, here is Yemen, here's Saudi Arabia, here's Egypt and Libya, South Sudan, Ethiopia, right? Eritrea and Djibouti. And so you can see, wow, here we are in this very turbulent area of the world, with Libya being in conflict, which the U.S. precipitated under such ghouls like Samantha Power and Susan Rice and Hillary Clinton, who was the facilitator of this conflict. Egypt, which has been not much of a conflict with the government, but between the people and the government, which the government has been under corrupted rule under Nouri Malki and others as well. The problem with the Muslim Brotherhood, which was reformatted over the decades, and of course, corruption between the classes. This is one of the, I think, the leading country outside the United States that has the class warfare system that's been the last almost 200 years. Saudi Arabia, do I need to remind you about the largest humanitarian crisis between Yemen and Saudi Arabia? In fact, the Libertarian Institute under the great Kyle Angelone, Dave DeCamp, and Patrick McFarlane, Will Porter, and others, Connor Freeman, have been, relentless in their reporting. And they've been fantastic about reporting what's going on here, which of course the U.S. is facilitating as well, because under the Biden administration, what did they say? Well, we're not going to give weapons to Saudi Arabia in their fight against Yemen. Well, what happened in the first 2 weeks of the Biden administration? Largest military aid package, which added to the conflict. The plans under consideration include sending a contingent of U.S. troops to Port Sudan, which is usually never good, on the country's Red Sea coast to coordinate departures. European and African nations have spent their week evacuating civilians, including organizing air flights out of the country, amid the calmer circumstances under the ceasefires. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said Monday that the U.S. government would continue to coordinate with allies and partners who are conducting their own operations and to leverage those efforts to include Americans. Because when it comes to Americans, we want a ceasefire. When it comes to everybody else, we don't give a shit. At least two citizens is among those who have been killed in the violence, officials have confirmed. And to the United States, well, that's an act of war. And that's it. It's a short article, gives you the short rundown. Now, what I want to do is add a little bit of context to what is happening, and that is the political context. Why this is happening, what led to this. And I'm going to read from a number of articles, including Wikipedia, Al Jazeera, The Telegraph. I'm going to use PDF files to give you a broader context, and hopefully I can simplify this context in just a matter of minutes. And so what we have is the former president and the military strongman, Omar al-Bashir, who presided over the war in Darfur, which was a conflict that began in February 2003, when the Sudanese Liberation Movement and the Justice Equality Movement rebelled groups against fighting against the corrupt government. And what happened was they oversaw state-sponsored violence in the region of Darfur, which has been under conflict for decades. It's just a war-torn part of the country, which led to charges of war crimes and genocide from the Rome Statutes, which is the International Criminal Courts, also known as The Hague, which, by the way, Sudan is a co-signer of. Approximately 300,000 people were killed and 2.7 million were displaced in the early part of the Darfur conflict between 2003 and 2007, I want to say. Key figures that were involved with this conflict included Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo. Remember, who's the general, right, that I talked about, who was a warlord who commanded the RSF that's currently in conflict against the other general. I forgot his name because I have a short-term memory loss. The Rapid Support Forces, which evolved from the Janjaweed, which the Janjaweed are a Sudanese Arab militia group that operates in Darfur and Chad. They have also been speculated as being active in the Yemen crisis. They're composed of Sudanese Arab tribes, and the core of who are just camel trading tribes that are active in Darfur and parts of Chad. They also were involved in slaughtering non-religious tribes in Sudan. They've been convicted. They've been subjected under the ICC, the International Criminal Court, is conducting in war crimes. Omar al-Bashir relied upon the Janjaweed and the RSF to crush the uprisings of ethnic Africans, especially in the Nuba Mountains, which are basically located in South Sudan, or South Kufadan in Sudan. And Bashir allowed for the RSF to perpetrate mass killings, rapes, pillage, torture, and the destruction of whole villages, which is amounted to ethnic cleansing of the Furi, the Masalat, and Zaghawi tribes. And basically, the United States didn't intervene. They intervened when it came to al-Qaeda, because bin Laden was threatening the United States. But because the Janjaweed are not threatening U.S. interests, well, who gives a shit? That's what I said before. Who cares? You're not killing U.S. citizens. Nobody else is really a human being to these people, especially when it comes to Africa. We, God's sakes, for the last 50, 60 years, we have ignored the plight of Africans. And I think it's a mixture of just racism and also not relating to U.S. interests. When it comes to the mining industry, when it comes to diamond mines, aluminum, interests that involve, especially with the church. It's alleged that Pat Robertson, the 700 Club, has diamond mines in North Africa. I'm not going to get into that because this is about the Civil War, but there's some nefarious underdoings regarding what's going on in Africa, and it's horribly misreported. But in 2013, Bashir actually formalized the militias, creating the RSF as the paramilitary organization and giving its commanders formal military ranks. Now, we're talking about a band of, bandits and groups that are conducting war crimes into a military, an unrecognized military. Nobody outside of Bashir's Sudan would recognize this as a military, but they are. He gave them ranks and everything to remain loyal to him. And Hermidet was given the rank of lieutenant general. This guy's committing, killing thousands of people here. Mass rapes, pillaging, and just the amount of crimes, ridiculous. And fast forward to 2017, there was a new Sudanese law that gave the RSF the status of an independent security force. Now, just imagine if the President of the United States gave, I don't know, who would be a group, like a group. Let's just say the Proud Boys. Right? This group of ragtag bunch that are probably infiltrated by the FBI or Joint Terrorism Task Force, right? It gave them legal authority as a police force or a security force, and that they could crush any uprising to President Trump. I'm just using Trump. Whatever, Biden, or it was Biden, the people on the right, why are you picking on us? Let's say Biden gave Antifa, this unchecked authority, security status to battle against their political dissidents. Same thing. It's the same thing as having the RSF as, an unrecognized group that's committing crimes and led by this very brutal and oppressive president. And during this time, the RSF developed a working relationship with the Russian private military outfit, the Wagner Group. And the Wagner Group is a Russian military organization, which is described as a private military company in the same way as Blackwater was. These developments ensured that the RSF grew into the tens of thousands, because what they did was basically recruit people. You have an oppressed people that don't want to be victimized and says, you know what, I'm going to go and join with the oppressors. This is psychological manipulation as well, which is unreported. I don't want to be the next victim. I would rather I'd rather victimize other oppressed people than be a victim, instead of fighting back against your oppressors. And I can understand why they don't, because they don't have the means, nor the avenues, nor the weapons, or the numbers to fight against your oppressor. You know, it takes guts to fight against the majority of evil when you're in a minority of good. And what happened was the Bashir regime allowed for the RSF and other armed groups to proliferate to prevent threats to the security force and keep them in power. It's a practice known as coup proofing or coup proofing. Also known as a coup d'etat. And in December 2018, what happened? Well, the people had enough. Protests against the Bashir regime began. And thus began the first phase of the Sudanese revolution that started on December 19th, 2018. 8 months of straight up civil disobedience were met with, of course, as predicted, violent oppression from the RSF and the Bashir government. However, in short order, as with most corrupt regimes, you have a corrupt military. Now, Bashir had to have known this, that the military under him would be like, you know what? We want the people on our side to keep order. And so how do we do that? By ousting the very leader that you were serving under. And so a coup began. In April 2019, the military, including the RSF, committed a coup d'etat on Omar al-Bashir, finally ending his over 30 years of establishing rule over the country. And what happened was the group established a transitional military council, almost like what we saw in Libya. And Bashir was imprisoned in Khartoum. But he was not turned over to the to the Hague, the International Criminal Courts, which, by the way, issued long-standing arrest warrants for Bashir that started during the Darfur Civil War. And the protests, which were continuing, called for civilian rule to govern the country because they wanted a government controlled by the people. Who wouldn't? However, as we have with corrupt groups like the RSF and the military, in June of 2019, the RSF perpetrated the Khartoum massacre, which basically saw the armed forces of the Sudanese Transitional Military Council, headed by the RSF, use gunfire and tear gas, which killed over 100 people. And tensions between the people and the RSF began because in August of 2019, after just international pressure, mostly from Europe, and a mediation by the African Union, the military agreed to share power in an interim joint civilian military unity government headed by a civilian prime minister who goes by Abdel Fattah, with elections to take place in 2023. But in October of 2021, the military seized power in a coup led by the Sudanese Armed Forces. And that was the person's name, who I forgot before, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, and the RSF leader Dagalo. And what transpired from this was the Transitional Sovereignty Council, which was reconstituted as a military junta led by al-Burhan, who's monopolizing power. However, and this is current, tensions between the RSF and the Sudanese junta began to escalate in February of this year, as the RSF began to recruit members once again from across the Sudan. And there was a brief military buildup in Khartoum, which was succeeded by an agreement to de-escalate, which allowed the RSF to withdraw its forces from Khartoum. But it was delayed due to renewed tensions between the generals, between the two allies who were instrumental in overthrowing Bashir, Burhan, and Dagalo, which leads to now the current conflict between Burhan and the RSF and Dagalo, who is now the deputy chairman of the Transitional Sovereignty Council. And so what do we have? Well, we have currently the RSF launching multiple attacks on Sudanese Armed Forces bases across the country, including the Khartoum International Airport, the Marau Airport, the El Obeid Airport. This way, nobody could get in the country and nobody could get out. Clashes between the RSF of al-Burhan and the Sudanese military led by Dagalo continue, but right now there is a tentative ceasefire between the two. So now what comes from it? Well, we hope that there is a compromise, that the people are instrumental in forcing the two generals to coexist or to acquiesce power in order to allow for a interim government, hopefully under the pressure from the international community. You know, the U.S. won't get involved, but with the African Union and the international European community getting involved, saying, listen, let's build an interim government. Let's have a vote by the people and have Dagalo and Burhan basically not entertain any more conflict, dissolve the groups, the RSF and the Transitional Council, and have a country led by a government that the people can vote in, which will act on good faith. Hopefully, we won't see any U.S. influence in the country, because when U.S. influence generally leads to problems, that's usually the case. So hopefully that will give you a brief history of what's going on currently in the Sudan. And I'll always update you when it comes to relevant news about what's going on around the world. For more information about what's going on, not just in the Sudan, but what's happening in Yemen, what's happening in Ukraine, please follow the Libertarian Institute, and I'll link them at the bottom of the description. Have a good afternoon, everybody. See you in the next video.